Hello, and welcome to this second video in Christian theology in encounter with other faiths. In this short video, I'm going to introduce us to some of the key ideas in Islamic thought. And then when we meet together over Zoom, we will unpack them together and share in conversation about them. So firstly, before we get into the detail of Islam itself and the meaning of the word and some of the key principles within it, we're going to look behind it to what was in existence in Arabia before Islam came on the scene. So we're in Arabia in the 6th century, and we're going to look at some of the religious and cultural and political features very briefly, very superficially. The first thing to appreciate is that religiously, it was an environment where people believed in many gods and spirits. Allah is simply the name for God, but God was understood as the sort of chief god who had 3 daughters, 3 goddesses, and then there were multiple other spirits and divinities in the environment as well. So Mecca was a significant place right back then as well, and in the middle of Mecca there was this Kaaba, this center where people went to honor the idols of the different divinities and goddesses. So it was a place of pilgrimage, a place where people were expected to go to pay in order to honor these goddesses and divinities. And there was a particular class of people, the Quraysh tribe, who were responsible for maintaining this and who were the custodians of the idols, and who expected people to pay. And so they exploited the peasant class. They made people come again and again, paying their money, paying their dues in order to honor the goddesses, God, and the different divinities and spirits. So it was an expensive business. We also have many spirits out in the wider world too. I believe they didn't just live at the Kaaba in Mecca. They were active out in the world. And so things like sandstorms were attributed to mischievous spirits called jinn, J-I-N-N, not G-I-N, J-I-N-N, mischievous spirits that whipped up sandstorms to cause trouble for people. But there were also good spirits who lived at oases, so places of refreshment and safety. So religiously, you've got one god, goddesses, you've got many spirits, and people honoring them, and people feeling a sort of fatalistic world where these things cause bad things and good things to happen, and people are subject to these forces. Culturally, we've got many tribes, an expectation, though, even despite the sort of tribal allegiances, that if people get lost in the desert, that they should show hospitality to the stranger. But you've also got, in places like Mecca, a growing urban commercial center. You've got people making more money. It's on the Silk Route through from Asia through to North Africa and through to Europe. So it's there's a growing trade in different things, silk amongst them. And so some people are becoming very rich, and there's a pressure on traditional ties that bound people together as people get more money and other people are left behind. And so there's to a certain extent a breakdown in social norms about how people behaved. The culture is under strain. But also religiously, we've got an environment where there are Jewish centers, like in the large town of Medina. You've got Christian monasteries far away from orthodoxy in Eastern Europe and so on. But you've got Christian monks moving through, Jews moving through, a mix of religious ideas as people explore issues of truth. And so it's into this world that Muhammad is born in the year 570. He was orphaned by the age of 6. He grew up in poverty. He had very lowly work until the age of 25. And then he came to marry an older woman, Khadija, who was a wealthy widow herself. And as Muhammad sort of then grew further in his sort of spiritual quest, he became someone impressed by the Hanifs, a group of people who were searchers, who became convinced that actually there should only be one God, and that people have got a distorted sense of things, and that the mess that society is is heading into seems to be connected to this belief in many spirits, many goddesses, and so on. And so there was an opportunity for Muhammad to meditate, and it is during his meditations, particularly in caves, that the story goes in Islamic tradition that the angel Gabriel appeared to him over a series of years, revealing to him what was known as the recitation, reciting to him God's word, the Quran, which means recitation, and that this was revealed to Muhammad, and then he shared it with others, persuaded others. Some people were receptive, some people obviously were not receptive, and then over time the Quran was written down. So he had concerns about the polytheistic traditions of the world around him, people believing in many gods. He had concern about the breakdown of social norms, of how people cared for each other. He had interest in Jewish traditions and Christian traditions, but felt that some of those were distortions of the truth. He was interested in the idea of there being one God instead of all this corrupt practice that was going on at the Kaaba. And he had a strong sense that religion and politics should work together in order to build a fairer, more just society. That with one God, we are under one God, we are one community. And so he sought to bring unity between the tribes, unity between the rural environment and the city, and to bring about a reawakening of what he believed to be an ancient truth. So a brief pause there as we think about this ancient truth, Islam, as it was called, that it's not just a new religion that came about with Muhammad, but that he was convinced that he was reawakening a reality that is how things are always, how they are always meant to be, how they were from the beginning, and calling us back to it. The truth is that there is one God, Allah, simply meaning God. And so that all the polytheism should be replaced by strong monotheism, the oneness of God. And that God is judging us for living in a more divided way, and is judging us for the ethical implications of our lives, how we treat one another, and that we will be judged at the end by the balance of good deeds and bad deeds. And that the prophets throughout the ages in different places were pointing to this truth again and again in their own way, that there is one God and that we are called to live in a spirit of oneness with each other. But each of the religions that gathered around these prophetic figures, for Muhammad, these other traditions had distorted it. So Judaism had distorted it by making it all about particular practices, binding a particular culture together. Whereas for Muhammad, this is meant to be a universal message of living under God's will for all people. And Christians had gathered too much around particular traditions to do with Jesus himself, though Jesus had been a true Islamic prophet, pointing to the oneness of God and how we should live at one with one another. But for Muhammad, there were distortions in how Christians treated the prophet. So a key point there, that the prophets were right, but the religions that gathered around those prophets distorted things. So Muhammad represents the final corrective revelation. God is revealing something to Muhammad and through Muhammad that is true now for all time and all people. That all the errors that had crept into previous religions are being put right. So there is one God. We are called to live in a spirit of oneness under the one God, to live according to God's will. Muhammad is then the seal of the prophets, a human being, but someone who managed to bring the spirit of God's word into fulfillment, to exemplify what is required of us, and that we should follow both the Quran and the lifestyle of Muhammad. So pause there just a moment as we think about this word Islam then. If that's the very nature of how things are meant to be, how they were from the beginning, but how they became distorted, and how Muhammad is calling us back to them, this state of Islam, what does the word mean? It simply means submission or surrender, in particular surrender to God's will, that all things are called to live in accordance with God's will, and that all things will in the end be in accordance with God's will. But religions, politics, all sorts of other things distort us away from this message. And so Muhammad is calling us back to it, to live in surrender to God's will. Not my will, but your will. So it's a very monotheistic tradition, a focus on the oneness of God. Not only that there is one God, but that God cannot be divided into different bits. God is one, and the community that lives under God should also be one. It's the very order of things, the very nature of how things are intended to be. So you see here there's two different ways in which Islam can be understood. It is the religion that begins with the person of Muhammad and that follows him since, and those who belong to it are Muslims, which means submitters, those who submit to God's will. But also it means the very nature of how things are meant to be and how they have been from the beginning, so that other people can be caught up in this whole thing called Islam. So in some respects, Christians and Jews are also regarded as Muslims with a small m, in that they are people of the book who try to follow the truths of this idea of living in accordance with God's will. But they are not sort of Muslims with a capital M, because they are not following the clearer, focused, the more corrected, the better corrected, the final version of things as Muhammad declared them to be, having received the recitation from Gabriel. So we're going to explore that tension between the very nature of things, Islam, and the religious tradition of Muhammad, and how both things can be Islam, and where does that leave different people within these different things. We'll come and explore that tension a little bit more as we gather together. I hope these few thoughts have started to stimulate your own thinking. We look forward to the conversation.